There is a postulation in quantum mechanics called the totalitarian principle, and it states that whatever is not forbidden is compulsory. If something is not physically impossible, it will eventually happen. All else is just a matter of time. I've related this proposition in a previous Broken Arrow essay, with the intention of expressing the kind of fear political and military observers must have felt when reviewing the Airborne Alert program. By 1968, Strategic Air Command had flown thousands of missions during Operation Chrome Dome, and in all that time, they had never once detonated a nuclear bomb in error. However, they had lost or damaged several weapons since their creation 2 decades before, and after the highly publicized events at Palomares in 1966, the world was beginning to suspect that the compulsion of the totalitarian principle would be soon to manifest. But the Air Force had a job to do. The Soviets were not some ponderous postulation spewed by eggheads in patched sweaters. They were real, their bombs were real, and their threats were many and ominous. With every feasible failsafe having been adopted, and every procedure meticulously followed by SAC's stalwart airmen, their commanders-in-chief were more than confident that they had eliminated all but the most remote possibility of accidental detonation. And what was more, they had a track record to prove it. But Goldsboro and Palomares did happen, and the radiological consequences served to remind the world that nuclear accidents are not ordinary. Indeed, it never mattered to the people of NATO, much less the Soviets, whether SAC's fail-safe devices functioned normally or not. The remote possibility was still there, unforbidden and inevitable. And on January 21st, 1968, the chaotic specter of probability would cast a shadow on the Airborne Alert program under which it would finally end. Yet one more B-52 would set out across the wild northern skies above the ice caps of Greenland. 4 more hydrogen bombs would go with it, and all of them would be lost. The debate over the Airborne Alert program's safety and efficacy had been raging since its inception. For nearly the entire decade of the 1960s, the U.S. Air Force maintained a constant flight of at least 4 bombers, cruising along flight paths that would allow easy access to Russian targets. It was the only way to be sure we could strike back in the event of a surprise attack, the only way we could assure destruction mutually. But the cost of 12 B-52 flights a day with KC-135s for refueling was significant, in terms of manpower, materials, money, and even public opinion. During its 8-year tenure, Chrome Dome ended up costing the American taxpayer at least $984 million, or about, wait for it, $8.7 billion if adjusted for inflation. And that's not even mentioning the price of training pilots, air crews, and ground crews. The B-52 is a marvel of a warbird, but she doesn't fly cheap. And folks in the defense community started to wonder if the potentially infinite price tag on Airborne Alert was really worth it. In addition, the advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles in the 1950s, followed by the rapid technological improvement in the 1960s, gave Chrome Dome's critics an easy alternative. Missiles required less manpower, were much cheaper, and could be stored until use and put into action at a moment's notice, unlike a bomber which would be useless unless already airborne. This position was presented to SAC in the late 50s, but was quickly undercut by the towering specter of the missile gap. The missile gap was a hot topic for Cold Warriors in the US, who took some dubious intelligence and mixed it with bloated Soviet threats to produce a horrifying but totally false narrative. That being, the Russians have more missiles than we do. Again, this was almost never true during the Cold War, and even when it was true in the very, very beginning, the Soviets didn't even have enough deployable warheads to arm their scant R-7s. Whether the DoD knew this or not
We're in the money.
is sort of irrelevant at this point, because they managed to use this fear to justify Chrome Dome. If the Russians had more missiles, we needed a fast and reliable way to even the odds. But before long, it became quite clear that we had at least reached parity with the Russians' missiles, with our boys inventing the first MIRV and quickly eclipsing the Soviet rockets in everything from speed to accuracy. So it seemed obvious that we didn't need B-52s constantly buzzing around the Northern Hemisphere anymore. And last but not least, SAC had to contend with the already proven propensity for accidents during Chrome Dome flights. Hundreds upon hundreds of flights over the years had necessarily led to a handful of accidents, and there was no way to prevent every solitary fluke from turning into a catastrophe. SAC had managed to prevent the worst from happening, but in another 8 years, and thousands more flights, anything could happen. How much longer could SAC hope to walk across this tightrope? The first casualty of this policy war was the hardhead leg of Operation Chrome Dome, a mission that would see a B-52 flying over Baffin Bay until reaching Thule Air Base in Greenland. Once over Thule, the B-52 would enter a holding pattern in which the pilot would fly figure eights repeatedly in order to test the efficacy of the new Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, or BMEWS. This system was state-of-the-art tech for the day, and naturally it was designed to warn the US if the Soviets launched any sort of attack over the North Pole. Funnily enough, BMEWS was one of the factors cited by SecDef Robert McNamara when he proposed ending Chrome Dome, amongst a host of others I discussed earlier. In the end, the Joint Chiefs managed to negotiate the survival of Chrome Dome, but vastly cut back, allowing SAC no more than 4 B-52s in flight at any given time.
Disappointed!
However, the hardhead leg was totally cut from the plan, as BMEWS had made it redundant in the eyes of the DoD. The Thule Monitor mission was ended in 1966, so there would be no more armed flights over Greenland. No more.
I believe them. Checks out to me.
So anyway, the Air Force continued flying the hardhead leg without the knowledge of civilian officials in order to maintain 24-hour visual contact with the BMEWS radar array, just in case. Not every B-52 packed nukes on this trip, but most of them carried 4 B-28 hydrogen bombs, each with a 1.4 megaton yield. Captain John M. Haig was the aircraft commander of B-52 58-0188, designated Hobo 28. This aircraft was another B-52G, crewed by 7 men carrying 4 B-28 thermonuclear bombs. Hobo 28 began its fateful mission on January 21, 1968, when it took off from Plattsburgh Air Force Base in New York. I've talked about the B-52G twice now, both in my Goldsboro video and my Palomares video, so again, I won't spend too much time on the technical details here. However, there is one factor in the aircraft design that bears mentioning, but I'll get into that a little later. Hobo 28 was flying the now top-secret Hardhead mission, seeing the aircraft gun it over Baffin Bay to the monitoring station over Thule Air Base in Greenland. The mission was codenamed Junkie 14, and would see these 7 men airborne for 21 to 24 hours. As such, the stick would be shared by 3 pilots, just like normal, with the additional men for Hobo 28 being Captain Leonard Svitinko, the co-pilot, and Major Alfred DeMario Jr., the third pilot. But sadly, neither fellow would get a turn to fly the plane before disaster would strike. The crewmen loaded up Hobo 28 with their food and gear, along with a stack of cloth-covered foam cushions placed precariously under the navigator's seat. These cushions were there to provide temporary ass relief to the beleaguered crewmen, who would be forced to sit on hard metal ejection seats during the day-long mission. 4 total cushions were placed under the navigator's seat, and another crewman put his metal lunchbox in front of them. Haig piloted the B-52 over the Canadian East Coast before swinging northwest over Baffin Bay on its way to Thule. About 4 hours into the flight, it was time for their first mid-air refuel. And it went totally fine. No problems whatsoever. No, seriously. Approximately 5 hours into the flight, just after the successful refuel, the crew began to complain about the cold temperature in the plane. Mind you, Hobo 28 was currently flying over Greenland within the Arctic Circle, so needless to say it was pretty chilly. To relieve the frigid crew from the bitter cold, the co-pilot threw the heat control to full open, allowing bleed air from one of the jet engines to enter the heating ducts. Shortly thereafter, the E-Dub, Captain Richard Marks, reported smoke and fumes in the crew cabin, and a search was immediately ordered by Captain Haig to find the source of the fire. And sure enough, after removing the metal lunchbox from under his seat, the navigator, Major Frank Hopkins, found the smoldering cushions. Major Hopkins began fighting the fire with a small fire extinguisher, but it was too late, and the flames were spreading uncontrollably. Haig requested clearance to make an emergency landing at Thule and began descending. Barely a moment later, disaster struck, and electrical power was totally lost from Hobo 28. Haig wasted no time and ordered his crew to begin bailout procedures. He flew over the airbase as the crew began bailing out, with every crewman escaping the plane before it banked left towards Volstenholme Fjord. At approximately 4:39 p.m., Hobo 28 impacted the frozen sea ice, utterly disintegrating in a ball of explosive fire. Though the crew all managed to escape the B-52, not all of them survived. The co-pilot, Captain Leonard Zvitinko, hadn't been in his ejection seat when the bailout was ordered, and it was speculated that he hit his head on his way out of the escape hatch, though it is not known if he was killed right then or upon impact with the ground. In addition, Major Hopkins had ejected first, landing furthest from Thule and having no clue which direction he needed to walk to find rescue. Rather than wander aimlessly in the fast-darkening north, he opted to wrap himself in his parachute and wait out the night. He was found the next day, exhausted and frostbitten, but alive. He, along with the rest of the crew, were taken to Thule Air Base for medical treatment, as meanwhile, the wreckage of their B-52 blazed over the ice, the bombs on board having surely succumbed to the flames. So here we are again, after the violent destruction of a state-of-the-art bomber over thankfully friendly territory. 4 bombs had been lost, presumably to the explosion, and a whole lot of debris had been scattered over a large area. And though there would be no costly ocean floor search, at least not yet, there were more than a few obstacles in the way of the searchers. For starters, Hobo 28 was carrying a full complement of jet fuel when it exploded on the ice. That's roughly 48,000 gallons. In addition, all 4 bombs detonated their non-fissile explosive when they were engulfed in the fireball, meaning that the failsafes included in each system worked as designed, with SAC later confirming there was no chance of nuclear explosion at Thule.
Nice.
But of course, just like at Palomares, the conventional explosion would have dispersed the radioactive components of all 4 bombs across the breadth of the crash site, an area of roughly 30 square miles. Earlier, when I said Hobo 28 disintegrated above the ice, I was not exaggerating. The explosion was so powerful that the largest single piece of debris recovered was about the size of a standard office desk, meaning that small pieces of potentially radioactive wreckage had been scattered across the ice. Most of the contamination was found to be concentrated in a 3 by 1 mile strip of ice that would later be dubbed the blackened area, thanks to the scorching heat from the fuel fire. And speaking of fuel fires, the next major issue with the salvage effort would be the melting and refreezing of the ice shelf.
When the plane went down, it tended to melt the ice and then plate the thing, so you had a layer of ice over the top of the contamination.
The airmen at Thule had not attempted to put out the blazing wreckage the night of the crash, and though a survey team viewed the crash the next day via dog sled, a more thorough investigation would have to wait until the 25th, 4 days later, due to snowstorms. This meant that after the fires finally went out on their own, they had melted large portions of the ice cap, all the way through to the sea in some cases. As a result, when Project Crested Ice kicked off immediately after the crash, General Hunziker, the project lead, knew they would be collecting a lot more than just debris during their salvage missions. Camp Hunziker was constructed near Thule to facilitate the cleanup, and it was furnished with helipads, igloos for storage and living quarters, and very soon, decontamination stations and medical facilities. On the very next day after the crash, before surveys began in earnest, the first team out managed to mark a 0 alpha line, a boundary around the crash site where no plutonium contamination could be detected by the surveyors. Once again, the Air Force was facing the unseen specter of alpha radiation, a kind of contamination that is extremely hazardous to living things, but only if inhaled or ingested. And this time, it seems the cleanup crew was taking no chances with their personnel. At least that's what was reported. The airmen involved in the salvage were already wearing heavy winter clothing, suitable to guard against alpha radiation, and airmen who went into particularly dangerous zones were undressed in decon tents and administered nasal swabs to check for alpha contamination within. In addition, as the effort grew in size, Danish Greenlanders were involved in the cleanup as well, but only in less contaminated zones than the Americans. Or so it was reported, but we'll come back to that discussion later. At any rate, large portions of the ice were searched, with every visible piece of debris being flagged, collected, and stored for transportation back to the States for disposal. But with the severity of the melting and the potential for later contamination if the ice caps thawed, it was determined that some amount of snow and ice would need to be removed from the site. The ice in the blackened area was found to have contained about 3.2 kilograms of weapons-grade plutonium, and in the end, the salvage effort would see 6,000 cubic meters of ice and snow removed from the site. The ice, snow, and debris were piled into plywood boxes, which were all transported back to Camp Hunziker via flatbed trucks and funneled into repurposed fuel containers, each with a 25,000-gallon capacity. This process was often aided by locals, both during transport and removal from the plywood boxes into the tanks. All in all, the debris and snow removal took about 13 days and filled 71 of the massive fuel tanks. During this portion of the project, no crewmen wore respirators, neither in the hot zones nor the transportation vehicles. This was due to the freezing temperatures that would have purportedly rendered the valves in the masks unworkable. However, the official report states that there was no airborne contaminant at the site and that the nasal swabs came back well within limits. No Americans were allowed in any hot zone above 450 disintegrations per minute as detected by an ANPDR-60 alpha survey instrument. Though it should be noted that DPMs are not as useful for calculating radiation hazards, as they don't indicate the actual dosage personnel might be receiving, only the amount of radioactive materials present in a given area. I was not able to find the dosage or a conversion rate for that particular instrument, so it is difficult to know just how many rads the Americans were getting. As for the local helpers, it was claimed that the Danes were not allowed in any areas with more than 0 DPMs. The salvage operation was further complicated by the featureless, snow-covered landscape of the fjord, which made it difficult for the first responders to navigate. In fact, the environment ended up being the most challenging aspect of the whole affair, with the short, dark days giving the workers little time to operate before site illumination could be sorted. And the frigid temperatures rendered everything from radiological survey instruments to personal protective equipment completely useless. The lion's share of the cleanup was over after 13 days, but during that time, EOD teams had been trying to account for all the pieces of the exploded bombs. For starters, every solitary core had been fragmented and scattered, and every secondary tritium bottle had been ruptured. This helped account for the 380 milligrams per square meter of plutonium in the blackened area, with a decreasing contour matching that shape spreading into the rest of the site. Specialists meticulously matched parts together until they could account for all but one of the 4 weapons' secondary explosive components. This is the portion with the tritium bottle that is responsible for the bulk of the bomb's yield, in painfully simple terms. When it became clear that the final secondary was not in or around the crash site, there was only one place left to search: under the ice. Yes, the loss of nuclear weapons had once again necessitated the use of submersible watercraft, but that would have to wait until August of the same year. For the moment, the search was ordered to a close, and Hunziker declared the site to be 93% free of radiation.
And that ain't bad.
The remaining 7% was planned to be swept up by the Star 3 submersible, but the dive did not go well, and the craft was unable to recover the missing pieces of the secondary explosive. Though it should be stated that the official report speculated that the pieces may have come to rest beyond the observed concentration of debris, which is government for, we couldn't find them and we aren't going to look for them anymore.
Oh God, I love this country.
Operation Crested Ice officially ended when the last tank of debris was sent home to the US on September 14, 1968. In the end, the cleanup had involved 700 personnel from Denmark and the US under the auspices of 70 government agencies, for the hefty price of $9.4 million, or about $83 million in 2023. After all of the death-defying heroics and eventful cleanups of my previous Broken Arrow docks, it might be easy to consider the Thule incident to be a bit of a non-event in the grand scheme of things. Obviously, I don't mean to discount the loss of Captain Svitinko, or even the hard work and effort of the cleanup crew, but really, it was just a big ball of fire in the frozen north, far away from anywhere a bomb could do great harm, right? Well, believe it or not, the Thule event would have a greater effect on American policy than any Broken Arrow before it, and the diplomatic and societal effects in Denmark were likewise very consequential. The presence of a nuclear-armed bomber over Danish territory ignited controversy that the US had violated Danish law, prohibiting the stockpiling of nuclear weapons in their territory. This issue was swept under the rug until the 1990s, when declassified documents revealed that nuclear-armed overflights had been recurrent during Chrome Dome.
I want to say, we are deeply sorry.
In the end, however, the scandal, dubbed Tulligate, was deemed the fault of Danish officials at the time of the base's construction in 1957. The official government report stated that the Prime Minister had been intentionally ambiguous about the restrictions Denmark would place on the US when they requested to build the Greenland base. And I think it's easy to understand why that might have been the case. As we know from my other Broken Arrows, America delivered fat paychecks to the nations that hosted their bases, and Denmark was a NATO country with a vested interest in being under the US nuclear umbrella. And let's be honest, it was probably really difficult for them to just say no. Next, there was the very real risk of the accidental destruction of the Thule airbase, or worse, the B-Muse radar array. In the remotely possible event that one of the H-bombs detonated over the area, it would have at least killed communications at the base for days, and could have possibly destroyed the early warning radar that SAC relied on so heavily. In the days or weeks-long recovery, the Soviets would have had a gaping hole in the US safety net to slip nukes through. And this wasn't just paranoia on the part of Chrome Dome dissenters, as after all, it was a huge part of the hardhead mission to make sure the Russians couldn't destroy B-Muse without us knowing. If the worst had happened, many speculate that SAC would not have waited to confirm the reason for loss of contact. It would have been wheels up and bombs away.
So we have to nuke them now!
And with that, I think it is long overdue that I talked about the actual chances of an accidental nuclear explosion of a bomber-borne weapon, in the event of a crash or otherwise. I have talked before about the meticulous lengths engineers and scientists of the day went to ensure safety when handling and transporting nuclear weapons, and all of those same fail-safes were in place during the Thule crash. Multiple implements were planned to prevent the accidental explosion of a bomb due to crashing. These involved dead switches in the release mechanism and in the parachute deployment systems. And above all of that, there was the master armed safe switch that had to be manually thrown on board the plane for the bomb to have any chance of detonating. And for those of you who don't already know, a nuclear weapon cannot be detonated by outside explosions, as the directed forces require a level of precision as to make such an event all but impossible.
I feel safer already.
So with all that in mind, it truly would have been a planets-aligning event for a nuclear bomb to go off on accident. And the folks at places like Sandia and Los Alamos put in a massive amount of effort to ensure that no such accident would happen. And after the constant flying and multiple accidents during Chrome Dome, that record remained intact. But even a near-perfect record cannot stand in the face of fear, controversy, and most importantly, money.
This is what happens when you cut money out of the military and put it into healthcare.
It's a good program, just give it a chance, that's all I ask!
Thanks to the events over Thule, the ever-mounting costs, and the elusive but still considerable danger, Operation Chrome Dome was ended, and the Airborne Alert program was finally put to rest in 1968, after 8 long years of flying. No matter what your thoughts are on the ethics or necessity of Airborne Alert, one cannot help but marvel at the Herculean effort put in by Strategic Air Command, its crews, and its pilots. And despite my seeming fixation on the few accidents they had, I have gained nothing else from this series, if not an enormous respect for the men of SAC. But the story of Thule wasn't quite over. I mentioned earlier that the leaders of Operation Crested Ice had been very serious about radiation safety, and that the Danish workers that assisted them in the cleanup have been kept from the hot zones. Well, if you can believe it, there are many who insist that the Air Force had not been totally truthful in their assessment of the risks involved.
I am shocked. Shocked! Well, not that shocked.
To begin with, Some critics have pointed out that the results of the nasal swabs used to detect alpha contamination would have been skewed by the constant snot flow from the Chile troopers. The doctors at Thule did take urine samples from time to time, and the results showed some light but overall harmless rads. But those same critics have argued that the lack of comprehensive on-site testing may have led to unrecognized radiation poisoning of salvaged personnel. It is almost not worth speculating, in light of the lack of PPE and close proximity to irradiated material, that American military personnel were exposed to unsafe levels of radiation. But unfortunately, the Air Force never regularly checked on the American personnel that worked at Thule, so it is impossible to know how many, if any, airmen were negatively affected by radiation later in life. The same cannot be said, however, about the Danish workers. In fact, the Thule crash became a national scandal for the country, starting in the 1980s, when epidemiologists started connecting higher cancer incidences amongst those that worked at Thule during Crested Ice. 410 workers out of a sample of 1,500 were found to have died of cancer, and later it was found that workers from that time were 50% more likely to develop cancers than those who came before or after. A collection of Danish workers even attempted to mount a lawsuit against the United States Air Force for not providing adequate protection during the cleanup. This lawsuit would ultimately fail, but it had resulted in a massive release of classified documents about the incident, which is where much of the information contained in this video comes from. In fact, the whole affair was such a big deal in Denmark that a movie was even made, dramatizing the events surrounding the lawsuits. It's called Idealisten, or The Idealist, and I really wanted to watch it before making this video, but unfortunately it seems to have been shipped to me via Longship and won't arrive until next month. It should be noted that the Danish government would ultimately reject any causal links between labor during Crested Ice and increased cancer risk. Though, oddly enough, some of the workers ended up receiving compensation from them to the tune of 50,000 kroner in 1995. The experts in the field pointed to the very low radiation levels indicated by the nasal swabs and on-site readings when they designated the danger as lower than the recommended reference level. Again, dissenting opinions would be quick to point out the ineffectual nasal swabs mentioned before and the lack of comprehensive urinalysis. In the end, like so many incidents before it, the Thule crash is just one more example of too little knowledge and not enough care. We will likely never know just how dangerous the conditions truly were, and no amount of compensation is ever enough to soothe lost years. It is true that you don't know what you don't know, but in 1968, I think we could have all expected a little better, and it is a real shame that lives may have been cut short due to negligence once again. And so it was that after so many near misses, the United States government decided to stop testing the totalitarian principle. Or at least not nearly as much as they had before. Nuclear weapons are still transported from place to place, and that terrible slim chance will never be fully reduced to impossibility. But the consequences of the crash over Thule demonstrated that there was indeed a line to be drawn between preparedness to face the enemy and recklessness with our own weapons. Who's to say that SAC would have ever dropped the biggest ball had Chrome Dome kept going? We can only hope that whoever watches over the nukes now treats them with the same level of care or better as SAC did for those 8 years. Hey everybody, thank you for tuning in for another Broken Arrow essay. Sorry this one was late. I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but I ended up getting sick and losing my voice for a few days and then having a cough for like a week, so I wasn't able to record when I wanted to, so it sort of set everything back. In addition, of course, there's still baby stuff going on, which has really put a lot on my plate. But she should be here very, very soon. In fact, depending on how quickly I edit this video, she could even be here, before this drops, so that's really exciting. That'll probably mean that this would be my last video for 2023, just because the month of December is going to be packed with baby stuff and Christmas and all that. So if I do release another one, it'll probably be like a Doom to Rewind video, maybe even on the Idealist, because that'd be kind of a cool companion for this one.
No way. Not this time.
So with that, I just want to say thank you everybody who hung in there with me for 2023. I know I didn't produce as many videos as I would have liked to, but I'm hoping that, once the baby gets here and we kind of work out a schedule, me and my wife, then I'll be able to get a more consistent production schedule going and put out more videos. But anyway, thanks again, and I'll see you all in 2024 if I don't see you before.